All right, here we go. HaYehudim. So now we recap the recap, because the whole first section of the Maamar is a recap of a Maamar from the previous Rebbe in Moscow in 1927. There's a big gathering. He was warned there was going to be spies there. There were spies there, and a couple months later he was arrested. And that's a whole big miracle. It was going to be execution, exile, then they're just get out of Russia. So massive miracle around all that. It's a big holiday in Chabad. So the short version, the previous Rebbe looks at the verse from the Megillah that says the Jewish people accepted upon themselves that which they had begun to do. What had they started that they are accepting now? So based on what the Gemara tells us is that what had they started accepting the Torah? The completion of the acceptance of the Torah is at the time of Purim. That's what the Gemara says. But what we're looking at is what is the distinction? What made Purim the final time of accepting it? So the previous Rebbe says because of the Mesiras Nefesh, the self-sacrifice that they displayed during that time. Not one Jew even considered converting out or leaving Judaism or anything like that, God forbid, and they studied Torah in public. This is what the previous Rebbe says. This is what is so distinct about the time of Purim. We went through a few other things talking about how the giving of the Torah was a time of great spiritual heights, a time of great physical heights, I guess you could say. They had just come out of slavery, so they were at the pinnacle of everything at the giving of the Torah. Purim seems like not. It seems like they're at the bottom of the totem pole for all of it, spiritually and physically, because they were all subject to this decree. They were subject to extermination, and spiritually because this time of exile where God seemed doubly hidden. The previous Rebbe says this is the distinction of Purim, why it culminates the giving of the Torah is because of Mesiras Nefesh that they displayed. Not only that, but it was Mordechai, who is the Moshe of his generation, who brought out this level of Mesiras Nefesh in the people. There's two parts. Number one, the fact that they studied Torah in public and nobody left the Jewish faith showed that they actively, in practice, they had the self-sacrifice. Who brought this level of self-sacrifice out of them? Mordechai. We saw other things also, how the children were willing to say that when Haman came from Mordechai, the children were like, no, we're going to go with Mordechai. So we saw that. Now, we get to the questions. We say that they accepted the giving of the Torah at the time of Purim because of what we call Mesiras Nefesh, which is self-sacrifice, the willingness to sacrifice themselves. But the previous Rebbe emphasizes that Mordechai is the one who brought this out of them. Why are we focusing on Mordechai? As in, it seems a non sequitur to bring it into the subject of why is Purim so special? Because they had Mesiras Nefesh. And not just that, there's an added focus on Mordechai teaching school children. Mordechai gathered thousands, 22,000 school children, and he publicly taught them Torah. That's great. Why is that connected to the Maamar? It's a double question. The second question we have is, why are we comparing the physical state of the Jewish people, not only the spiritual state? It makes sense to say, the giving of the Torah, they're great miracles, they're at the highest of spiritual states and great revelations. Purim, they're at the lowest, because it's a time of darkness. Because Torah is a spiritual endeavor, it seems. Why are we talking now about also the physical state? Next, we say the commandment of self-sacrifice is one commandment out of many. Why do we have such an emphasis on it? Specifically because there's a greater emphasis of living by the mitzvah. We're supposed to live for mitzvahs, not just die for mitzvahs, which we see the verse is v'chai behem. Someone's life is in danger. What's the decision to make? So v'chai behem, you're supposed to live by them. That's why we know that we're supposed to desecrate Shabbos and things like that. We know that there's a great emphasis of living for mitzvahs, not dying for mitzvahs. Why are we focusing on self-sacrifice? That doesn't seem like it should be the main focus. Not just that, but because at the time of the giving of the Torah, they also had a willingness to sacrifice themselves. Purim, they just did it in practice. So what is it about that putting it into practice that's so unique? Last question. Purim and Hanukkah is a time when everybody was under threat. So what is it specifically about Purim that's unique to the completion of the giving of the Torah? Besides for just the timeline aspect that Purim came first. What all the questions lead to is that there's something distinct about Purim. There's something going on there. Not only that, the emphasis of the Mesiras Nefesh of Purim is bolstered through Mordechai, especially teaching school children. So that's kind of like the three main areas of focus. Here's what's going to be. The questions, you're going to have to back burner them for a little bit, because now we're going to do a whole deep dive. What I did is, instead of giving the verses per question, I gave all the questions, then we'll see all the texts that go with it. And then we're going to go into a whole thing about the giving of the Torah. What changed with the giving of the Torah and things like that. Then, at the end, we'll come back to answer the questions, according to what we learned. These 4 questions are questions that the Rebbe asks on the previous Rebbe's Maamar. Okay, so first we see, this is the verse from Vayikra. Shmartem es chukosav es mishpata asher yaseh osam ha'adam chai behem. Ani Avaya, I'm Hashem. You observe my statutes, my ordinances, which your man shall do, and live by him. Emphasis, v'chai behem, live by them. Why are we so stuck on self-sacrifice when we're supposed to live for Torah mitzvah? Now we have here, this is from the Rambam. We're going to have a couple different texts that you're going to see different commentaries and perspectives on what self-sacrifice is, what this extent is that a person is supposed to sacrifice themselves. Rambam tells us, the entire house of Israel and all Jewish people are commanded regarding the sanctification of God's great name. As it states, and thou shalt be sanctified amongst the children of Israel. Also, they are warned against desecrating his holy name, as the above verse states, and they shall not desecrate my holy name. Both of these quotes come from the same verse. One is a commandment, a positive commandment to sanctify God's name, and one is prohibition against desecrating God's name. In Hebrew, we call it Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem. Kiddush Hashem is any time that your actions make a good impression of Judaism, basically. That's a Kiddush Hashem. This is the way a Jew behaves in an exalted sense. Because that means we're sanctifying God's name. That's saying that, like, look, following through God's path results in an excelsior sort of behavior, or a most kind sort of behavior. Anything that's a very positive image that's associated specifically by saying like, oh, this is how a Jew behaves in a very positive sense, that's a Kiddush Hashem. So that's a very big mitzvah. The Chilul Hashem, the desecration of God's name, God forbid, is if someone behaves negatively, and that has a negative impact then on the image of God in Judaism. That would be called desecration of God's name. There's a public perspective of it. It doesn't only have to be a public perspective. So anything that we do that exalts God's name versus anything that we do that could cast a shadow over God's name, basically. That's these two things. Yes, you must do this. Yes, you should do this. And don't do this. So the Rambam is talking about, he mentions these two verses. What is implied? Should a Gentile arise and force a Jew to violate one of the Torah's commandments at the pain of death, he should violate the commandment rather than be killed, because it states concerning the mitzvah, which a man will perform and live by them, as we just saw in the verse. They were given so that one may live by them and not die because of them. If a person dies rather than transgress, he is held accountable for his life. So what the Rambam is saying, building on these verses, if a non-Jew tells a Jew, violate this or you're going to be killed, the Jew can violate the commandment to save his life. Not just that, the Rambam is saying if the person does not choose to violate and instead chooses to save his life, he might be held accountable. You're supposed to live by them. The overriding commandment is to live by them. That's a big one, that you must live and not just try, not just zombie-like. Live with energy, live with enthusiasm. We're not done yet. The Rambam says, when does this apply? With regard to other mitzvot, with the exception of the worship of other gods, forbidden relations, and murder. We always say the big three, with murder, idolatry, and adultery. But the truth is not just adultery, it's any of the forbidden relationships. So, God forbid, if it would be like bestiality or rape or something. That's all forbidden relationships. Siblings or whatever, God forbid. So, any of that falls into that category. If a person says, do this or you're going to get killed, the person, for these three specifically, what overrides them is fulfilling that commandment. Shoot this person or I'm going to shoot you. Well, you don't murder another person. Bow down to the idol or I'm going to kill you. No, we don't bow down to the idol. These three mitzvos, with regard to these three sins, if one is ordered to transgress one of them or be killed, one should sacrifice his life rather than transgress. So what it means by that is that these three mitzvahs, because remember, we said, no, you're supposed to live by the mitzvah. So these three mitzvahs in particular, it's not about, oh, you have to die for the mitzvah. The point is that fulfilling these three in particular extend past the point of the threat to life. Versus the other mitzvah, you have to fulfill it in any way you can, but if it comes up to the threat of life, like Shabbos, for example, that mitzvah does not push past that threat of life. The emphasis is not on the be killed part. The emphasis is that these three particular mitzvot, they must be fulfilled even past the point of threat to life. They are fulfilled through going to that level. So in Judaism, for example, sidetrack, there's a law of a rodef. If you know someone has risen up, specifically is chasing someone down for the purpose of killing them, you are commanded to kill that person. You see if this person is intent on killing someone else, you have a mitzvah now to intervene. That's not considered murder though. This is, you must save this other life when it is clear that this person is trying to kill them. The Rebbe referenced that in regard to the line of Israel. That in the line of Israel, everyone's so worried about like the politics of things. Which war? It was before one of the wars. Maybe the 1973 war? The Yom Kippur War? I don't remember. It was before one of the wars that there was a clear threat. And the Rebbe was talking about how everyone was Israel. They were playing politics with it. Because, we should never be seen as the aggressor. And the Rebbe, you have the commandment that you must wake up and arm yourself to show that someone is coming to kill you. You don't just, we'll wait to see what happens. And the Rebbe didn't even say go and attack them. The Rebbe said just show that you're ready to fight, and that will be enough of a deterrent. When we talk about all these kind of commandments, we saw it in the last Sikha. The Torah gives the statement almost. And then you see how the commentaries, they keep expounding upon. We have to do whatever the mitzvahs say, but then there's the actively, we want to understand as much as we can. So when we try to understand it, we're trying to understand like what's the underlying philosophy of this. Now ultimately we can't understand. There is up to a point that we could wrap our minds around it. Remember when we did that whole thing of the Hanukkah Maamar, that the world was created for my sake? Adam was created and it was only him in the world. People stamp with the same stamp, but God, everyone has a different look, even though it's all the same stamp. Everybody in the world came from Adam, because you can't say one person doesn't make a difference. Then you're supposed to say because the world was created for my sake. I don't remember if I told you it originally, but that whole section comes in where they talk about how do we know that there's capital punishment for murder. The point that I'm making is that you see how they're not just like, the Torah says there's capital punishment. Okay, skip along now. Try to figure it out. We're supposed to be saving lives. How can we take a life? When you see that it's like this, you have today very well-meaning people who get very upset about capital punishment. Now, there's one thing to say, the justice system is a little bit messed up and sometimes innocent people end up on death row. That's one thing, and that's obviously, that's a real consideration. But in a philosophical sense, the value of life is so much that if someone takes a life, you destroy an entire world. So we'll just lock you up somewhere and everybody has to pay for you to be alive. It's not so simple. The rabbis, they try to figure it out. Like, how can the Torah say this? So there's also the question of can you intervene without actually killing them? Of course, if there's a way to stop it without, then you should always go in that direction. Someone was saying that they got a shotgun Because the shotgun specifically, they're like, I'm really hoping that just hearing the shotgun being loaded is enough of a deterrent. Because that's a loud gun. A lot of guns, there's a distinct click to them when they get loaded. But there's something about a shotgun that you hear it. Look, in places where there's a lot of high gun ownership, there's not usually a lot of petty crime. It changes the dynamic of crime. At the end of the day, it is an extreme action, and we don't usually jump to the extreme action. Please God, you'll never be in that situation. Anyway, all that to say, we can see that this whole idea of giving up life and that kind of stuff is, sure, we have the commandment, but it's not just so simple. So, transgress or be killed, one should sacrifice his life rather than transgress. When does the above apply? So even now, the Rambam is making qualifications. Is this an always thing, etc.? When the non-Jew desires his own personal benefit, for example, he forces a person to build a house or cook food for him on Shabbos, he violates a woman or the like. However, if his intention is solely to have him violate the mitzvot, the following applies. If he is alone and there are not 10 other Jews present, he should transgress and not sacrifice his life. However, if he forces him to transgress with the intention that he violate a mitzvah in the presence of 10 Jews, he should sacrifice his life and not transgress. This applies even if the non-Jew, the Gentile, even if the non-Jew intended merely that he violate only one of the mitzvot. The Rambam is saying that there's a distinction, aside from the three that a person has to rather give up their life for. It has to fulfill to the extent of even giving up their life for them. All the rest of them, the Rambam makes a distinction between it's happening kind of in private and the non-Jew just kind of like, I'm going to shoot you if you don't cook this food for me on Shabbos. Because that one, you're in a house somewhere and the non-Jew is just like, I want this food, so cook it for me. That the Rambam is saying you could do that to save your life. Versus if it's being done in public. So it's using 10 Jews here because this is not a public forum. So the Rambam says when it's a public forum, a person should rather give up their life for any of the mitzvot, no matter what it is. This goes back to that original thing that we're talking about, sanctifying God's name versus, God forbid, desecrating God's name. It is considered a sanctification of God's name when a person's in public, and no matter what that mitzvah is, to sacrifice themselves for that mitzvah. That is a testament of nothing overrides this. Also, the public setting is a place where there's going to be influence. The private setting, it's you and the other person that are there. All of this that we're looking at is just the way that it's explaining that even this idea of self-sacrifice is not just like, oh, sacrifice yourself dead. There's qualifications for it. There's an understanding for it. What does this mean? All this kind of stuff. But ultimately, it's still only one mitzvah of many mitzvot. Going back to the whole idea of the Maamar, why is there such a great emphasis on Mesiras Nefesh? And we have more about Mesiras Nefesh. This is from the Talmud. It's in two different parts of the tractate. The Gemara clarifies with regard to the halacha that the prohibition against idol worship takes precedence over saving one's life. From where do we derive this? As in that a person should give up their life rather than idolatry. As was taught in a Braisa is an earlier teaching. The Rabbi Eliezer says, if it is stated, and you shall love Hashem your God with all your heart and with all your soul, right? Shema. Why is it stated in the continuation of the verse, and with all your might? And if it is stated with all your might, why is it stated with all your soul? One of these appears superfluous. Rabbi Eliezer is saying, love your God with all your heart. That makes sense. With all your soul, this makes sense. With all your might, isn't that kind of like with all your soul? It seems redundant. Why do we have both of them? So he explains, rather it is to teach that if there is a person whose body is more beloved to him than his property, therefore is stated with all your soul. So a person whose physical self, this is the most important, I will do anything to save the physical self, that's why it says with all your soul. That you should love God with all your soul, as in to that extent of giving up yourself for him. The verse teaches that one must be willing to sacrifice his life to sanctify God's name. And if there is a person whose property is more beloved to him than his body, therefore is stated with all your might. As in, maybe your possessions are more important than your body and physical self, but even to that extent, with all your might. Rabbi Eliezer understands the phrase with all your might to mean with all your possessions. Therefore, one must be prepared to forfeit his life rather than be saved through idol worship. You have to be willing to give up everything, be it possession, life itself, rather than transgress on idolatry. And for the other mitzvah. That's one thing that the Gemara tells us. So again, the rabbis discussing these verses and what they derive from it. So Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe says, it is stated that the children of Israel shall keep Shabbos to observe Shabbos. Shemar b'nei Sasa Shabbos. If someone's life is in danger, it's not that the laws of Shabbos are suspended. You are commanded to desecrate Shabbos to save the life. By the way, someone's life in danger is like a woman goes into labor all the way to someone's life being in danger and you have to get him to a doctor or something. It's not that, oh, by the way, the laws of driving on Shabbos don't apply now. It's, no, desecrate Shabbos to save this life. Do whatever you have to do. Turn on the machines. Do whatever you got to do to save this person's life. By the way, that emphasizes that live by them is, again, an overriding feature. Because even Shabbos is like it, right? Shabbos is such a big one. But still, you have to live by them. This is where it comes from. If you've ever heard that idea before about you have to break Shabbos to save a life, this is where they discuss it. So desecrate one Shabbos and his bias, so he will observe many Shabbatot. The Gemara says rather to desecrate one Shabbos because do it for Shabbos itself, that this person now has the potential of fulfilling, observing more Shabboses. There's a side thing like, well, how do you know this person is going to keep Shabbos? So don't worry about that part. Save the life and the rest of it will take care of itself. Rabbi Yehuda said that Shmuel said, so everyone's quoting in the name of who they heard it, if I would have been there among those sages who debated this question, I would have said that my proof is preferable to theirs. As in the reason to desecrate is not because you're supposed to keep Shabbos, as the state shall keep my statutes, my ordinances, which a person shall do, and live by them, b'chai by him, and not that he should die by them. They're saying, how do you know that you break Shabbos? Because it says you're supposed to keep Shabbos. So you break Shabbos because they will eventually keep more Shabbos. The next rabbi comes in and he says, no, there's an overriding proof for that. The proof of that is live by them. You're supposed to live. In all circumstances, one must take care not to die as a result of fulfilling the mitzvot. Emphasis is on living. Rava commented on this. All of these arguments have refutations except for that of Shmuel, which has no refutation. So Rava, the next sage, comes in and all these other proofs that they bring in, they can be refuted somehow. But when you say live by them, we can't argue with that. Live by them is a very clear directive. He actually goes through the different arguments of that. And for all the other arguments as well, we have found proofs for saving a life from certain danger. But for cases of uncertainty, from where do you derive this, as in if we're not sure? For this reason, all the arguments are refuted. However, the proof that Shmuel brought from the verse, and live by them, which teaches that one should not even put a life in possible danger to observe mitzvot, there's certainly no refutation. Ravina said, and some say it was Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak who said, with regard to the superior proof of Shmuel, one spicy pepper is better than a whole basket of squash, since its flavor is more powerful than all the others. One spicy pepper is better than a whole basket of squash. I hope you take that line with you wherever you go. The first would teach about idolatry. A person should rather die than transgress on idolatry. And here they're saying there's this overriding commandment of live by them. We're going to see more of it, but all of these is just to emphasize the point about how Mesiras Nefesh, self-sacrifice, is just one mitzvah of many, and living by something seems to be the overriding mitzvah. Look, it's all over the Torah. So Sanhedrin, this is another part of the Talmud. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, he said that Rabbi Yochanan said, you see how they do this, by the way, that they're always quoting in the name of who they heard it from. Because as much as we can, we try to trace back a teaching. Remember that we're recording the oral law. So the oral law, it's passed down verbally. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, he said that Rabbi Yochanan said, the sages taught that one is permitted to transgress prohibitions in the face of mortal danger only when it is not a time of religious persecution. They're adding a new twist to it. But in a time of religious persecution, when the Gentile authorities are trying to force Jews to violate the religion, even if they issued a decree about a minor mitzvah, one must be killed and not transgress. So here, the distinction that they're making is not how many people are around. The distinction they're making is that, so for example, like a time of Hanukkah, when they're passing laws to say you're not allowed to fulfill this mitzvah, you must sacrifice yourself for that mitzvah. No matter how big or small that the mitzvah seems to be, a time of peace versus a time of persecution, that's where they make the distinction. This is commentary, it's called Tosefta Shabbat. So Tosefta, Bright is an early teaching, Tosefta is like an added-on teaching. So it's not in the Talmud, but it's within that time frame that these teachings come about. But all the commandments were only given to Israel that they might live by them. Chai b'hem, as is written, which a man shall perform and live by them. See, we see this verse has been quoted now multiple times. You shall live by them and not die by them. Nothing takes precedence over saving a life, save idolatry, forbidden relations, and murder. In which circumstances are these things said? When it is not a time of persecution. But, as in, v'chai b'hem, live by them, when it's not a time of persecution, that's when we say these things. But when it is a time of persecution, even when it comes to the smallest of small commandments, a person should die for it, as is written, do not profane my holy name. This we saw from the Rambam, says not to desecrate God's name. And the Lord made everything for his own sake. More examples of speaking about it, emphasis on live by him. Tanya! Chapter 25 is when we're talking about klipa and transgressions. And when a person transgresses, they're like less than the gnat. Even the gnat was created before you because a person has choice. The gnat can only be a gnat. So if a person makes a not good choice, then they fall lower than the gnat. And not just that, it was the whole idea about how it associated transgression, arrogance with idolatry. Idolatry is saying there's another God, God forbid. Anytime a person transgresses, they're saying there's another will out there besides for God's will. That's why it correlates the two. Remember the 3 cognitive soul powers and the 7 emotive soul powers? And we've seen that in the worlds and all that kind of stuff. Everything has its negative counterpart. Positive side of it, there's the healthy side of it, I guess you could say, and the negative part of it. Arrogance is the parent emotion, kind of. It's like the overriding emotion for all of it. As soon as you're asserting yourself as an I am, that's not submitting yourself to the absoluteness of God. So that's why all the negative emotions can only come with an assertion of an I am, this exaggerated sense of self. That was all connected from where this comes in Tanya. If you've noticed, and we're going to see it a lot here, that's why Tanya is very into trying to get us to get over ourselves, basically. We're physical beings living in a physical world, and we have a very strong drive within us that wants to live and live well. The body wants to live, right? The body will protect itself. We know that. We struggle for life. But so much of what we're battling against is getting too stuck in our own version of life versus remember what we're doing here. It's like when you're trying to do a project or something, and then someone gets really stuck on a side detail. And you're like, you just spent 3 hours arguing about a side detail. It doesn't even matter for the main project. You just wasted our time with that. So that's what we get like when we forget what the purpose of everything is. When you think that the means are the end itself. And it's not. Anyway, so let's wrap up. Tanya. This is talking about that a person would rather give up their life than transgress. We know that for those big 3. The Alter Rebbe says in Tanya is that if you realize that any sin, any transgression is a separation from God, if you can live with that mindset, then that's going to keep you from any transgression. Because a person would never want to be separated from God. In considering that he would gladly give up his life to not even momentarily be parted from Hashem, by practicing idolatry, he would realize that he ought to exert himself in the mitzvah, which bind him to Hashem forever. Mitzvah connects us to God, and that's a forever connection. Transgression is a momentary separation, but even though it's momentary, we don't want that. So we have to bring that to our conscious awareness. No, we can't have this. Thus, being aware of one's willingness to sacrifice his life for God affects both the areas of turn away from evil and do good, i.e. the observance of the prohibitive and positive commandments, respectively. Such awareness should constantly be on his mind, so he is always ready to apply it to his performance of the mitzvot. Something that we have to work on within ourselves is to remind ourselves you don't have to wait for the moment of the spiritual crises to be like, yes, I will die for God. Live for God too. In light of the above, it's understood by Moshe Rabbeinu, peace be unto him, in the book of Devarim, commanded the generation that entered the Holy Land that they too, and not only the subsequent generations, recite the Shema twice daily. Something the question number 3 I think it was. The intention in the Shema being to acknowledge the kingdom of heaven with self-sacrifice. Shema is like a martyrdom prayer. When we say Shema, we're supposed to think that we're willing to sacrifice ourselves for God, that we will not deny God and God's unity. The Shema teaches us to accept martyrdom for the sanctification of God's name. Why was it necessary for our forefathers to prepare themselves for martyrdom? Had they not been promised that God will lay the fear and dread of you upon all the inhabitants of the land? So God says, when you're going to go into the land of Israel, everyone's going to be afraid of you. They're going to run away from you. You'll be able to conquer the land, no problem. So why you read like, oh, have self-sacrifice? They don't need it. God said everyone's going to be afraid of us. They had no reason to fear anyone would force them to deny the kingdom of heaven, necessitating self-sacrifice to resist such efforts. In this sense, they were as well protected as the Jews who traveled the desert with Moshe, who were not commanded to recite the Shema. 40 years in the desert, Moshe didn't say Shema twice. It's only when they were going to go into the land of Israel that he's like, say Shema twice. We must therefore conclude that preparation for martyrdom is necessary not only to ensure it will be put into practice if and when necessary, but because the fulfillment of Torah mitzvot is contingent on being constantly aware of his readiness to surrender his life to God for the sake of his unity, in that a person remember that he would be willing to sacrifice his life for the sake of God's unity if the situation would warrant it, which is the message contained in the Shema. As in, if someone's struggling to fulfill a mitzvah, you have to remind yourself, I don't have to wait for spiritual crises to affirm my connection to God. And this is a forever connection because it's a mitzvah. You must therefore recite it twice daily, morning and evening. Everyone say Shema twice? Yes, in the morning and the evening. Say it nighttime, right before you go to bed. You're also supposed to say it in the morning. Bring it into the routine. Bring it in, so that this awareness will be fixed permanently in his heart and will not depart from his memory night and day. In this way, one is able to withstand his evil inclination to vanquish it at every time and every moment, even after Moshe's passing, whenever Jews are engaged in intense struggle with the evil inclination, as explained above. The Alter Rebbe is saying, when one remembers he is prepared to suffer martyrdom for his love of God and his belief in God's unity, he will surely be able to overcome his evil inclination and perform all the mitzvot. It's so important that I would never have this separation. Well, any little transgression, seemingly little transgression, is a moment of separation. That should strengthen us to not separate. And, if I for sure don't want to separate, then of course I would want to be proactive in creating forever connections. So we have the whole thing about Mesiras Nefesh, the whole emphasis about life. That's going to lead us now to why is the Mesiras Nefesh of Purim so critical? We said it was so critical, but I went through the whole thing about Mesiras Nefesh. Again, the question remains. And then we're going to get into the whole thing about the giving of the Torah, which eventually will loop back to figure out the answers.